Hi there and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to discuss the Portuguese language, how easy it is to learn, and whether it's even worthwhile learning as a foreigner living in Portugal in 2024. So initially, let me say that I have studied Portuguese. I studied it independently before I came to the country using a textbook called Ponto de encontro. And when I arrived here, I spent a semester in the University of Coimbra in their program for teaching foreigners Portuguese language and culture. My wife actually spent 2 terms there. And during the second term, while my wife was still in the university, I joined a special course organised by the Centro Qualifica in Coimbra, which ran courses for, still runs courses for immigrants looking to get A1, A2, B1 and B2 certification, basically either for jobs or for immigration, permanent residency and citizenship application purposes. So I actually did that in my first year in Portugal. So I do have some basis and some familiarity with the language. I just want to make that clear right at the beginning. I did actually opt to learn it even before I came here. Talking about whether or not I think it was a good investment to learn a bit of Portuguese and whether or not most foreigners need to do so, I think it depends on their circumstances, but in the majority of cases I think that Portuguese is not necessary. In my life, as someone who is early retired in Portugal, I never use it or almost never use it, and even when I do use it, is often refused by the Portuguese person that I'm talking to, and they will instantly recognize that I'm talking with a British accent and switch to English. And this happens in so many situations. Basically, in Portugal, I am a consumer. I'm a customer. Whether it's in a hotel or a restaurant, a tourist attraction, a shop, a supermarket, whatever, I'm the customer, and therefore the person who I'm talking to is usually someone who's delivering some kind of service or selling me some kind of good or product, and therefore they probably feel it's incumbent upon them to communicate with me in English, or maybe they just prefer it, maybe they want to practice, or they think their English is better than my Portuguese. Okay, whatever the reason may be, the fact is that it's very difficult to talk to Portuguese people in Portuguese because they will usually switch to English very, very rapidly. I would have to make a conscious effort to say to people, hey, no, I really want to speak in Portuguese, let's do that. And to be honest, I don't really want to do that. I'm very comfortable with speaking English because, it's easier for me and it gives me all of the advantages. If you're communicating in a language like Portuguese, which you know how to speak, but you don't know how to speak it that well, and certainly not as well as your native language, then it gives you disadvantages. Especially if you're in some kind of situation where you need to understand things better, or you're perhaps having an argument with somebody who's delivering a service to you. You don't want to do it in Portuguese. If you do it in Portuguese, then they hold all the cards. How does that make sense on any level? One of the main reasons why I chose to learn Portuguese is because I thought it would be necessary, but then it transpires it really isn't. A lot of the people who live around me, most of my friends, neighbours who live here, they're all expats. We all communicate in English. I don't know anybody who has a lot of Portuguese friends. They may have some Portuguese neighbours that they say hello to or something, but usually the conversations are in English. They're not taking place in Portuguese. I don't know anybody around here, of all the people I know, who has learned Portuguese to a level which is as good as mine or as good as my wife's. And nobody speaks Portuguese. When I had workers who came to my house I built a garage, I did a lot of work in the garden, I spoke Portuguese to them all the time. I never communicated with them in English. But these same workers worked in the houses of my neighbours, various neighbours actually, and they communicated in English with those guys. So I kind of regretted the experience of making all the effort to talk with them in Portuguese. You might think that being able to speak in Portuguese will prevent you from being ripped off, and certainly that's something that I had in my mind when I chose to learn the language. But sadly, no, I got ripped off just as badly, or pretty much as badly as everybody else around. And those are all foreigners. In Portugal, if you're a foreigner, if they think you have money, they're going to rip you off. That's just the way it is. It doesn't matter whether you speak to them in Portuguese, English, Chinese, whatever. They're going to try it on. It's just the way it is. So for daily life purposes, for me, doing things like shopping or interacting with companies like the water company, the electricity company, the local government, Portuguese is not necessary. You can go there and there'll be somebody who can speak English. Absolutely, certainly. I've never met a situation where I was not able to communicate in English, dealing with, for example, the tax office or any of these kind of things. I have not met it. Now, that does not mean that it doesn't exist. But in Portugal, it is the case that everybody has 7 years of compulsory education in the English language, at least when they are in school, and most people take it beyond that because obviously Portugal is a country where a lot of young people especially want to emigrate from. They want to go somewhere else, and of course English is the dominant language that they have to learn in order to do that. There are a lot of Portuguese working in Ireland, for example, which is a country where I hold nationality. English is a big part of Portugal because they receive a lot of tourists as well. So there's very much the sense that, Portugal is a country where most people anyway, can speak English at least to an acceptable level, and they will make the effort. If you're going to come here, perhaps come here later in life in your 50s or 60s and try to learn Portuguese, I think that whatever effort you make, unless it's absolutely stunning, is probably going to be less good than the 7 years that most Portuguese people put into learning English. Plus the fact that the dominant culture of the world is definitely American culture, and you're surrounded by music and movies and things like that are all produced in English. Portuguese people also grew up with this, and as a consequence they learn the language. As a Portuguese language learner, it's very, very difficult to immerse yourself in Portuguese culture and divorce yourself from, the dominant global culture, especially if that's actually your native culture as well. So, in my opinion, most people here don't make the effort to learn Portuguese. It doesn't impede them in any major way. The typical level of Portuguese that I find among most of my neighbours and acquaintances is being able to order stuff in restaurants and cafes. And to be honest, they're pretty happy with that. They don't meet major inconveniences as a result of it. As someone who speaks Portuguese to a much better level, it hasn't bestowed any advantages on me. I don't have many Portuguese friends or close contacts, and when I do interact with Portuguese friends, the communication is in English anyway. So that's the reality of the situation. Now, some people are going to say, well, in Lisbon or Porto or the Algarve, that might be true, but, in other parts of Portugal, people are just speaking Portuguese, they don't speak English. Well, I live in central Portugal. I live in Leiria, and I don't live in a big city. I live in a rural context. And, I can tell you that the situation is what it is here. You can communicate in English with the vast majority of people in the vast majority of circumstances. And certainly when I was living in Coimbra, it was exactly the same. I tried to speak Portuguese on numerous occasions in Coimbra, in restaurants and in shops and stuff, and almost instantly was cut off and the server would switch to English. That's just how it was. So what are the reasons why it would be necessary to learn Portuguese living in Portugal as an English-speaking expat? Well, in my mind, there's only actually one good reason, and that is if a person has the intention to become a Portuguese permanent resident or to become a Portuguese citizen, there is actually a language requirement attached to that. It's not a very high bar, it's at the A2 level, and there are two mechanisms for actually obtaining a certificate which will allow you to meet this requirement. Another reason to learn the Portuguese language well is, of course, if someone is coming to Portugal for work and you're going to work in a Portuguese company where Portuguese is the working language. However, I really don't think there are very many people with English as their mother language who are coming to Portugal for that reason, because you would, in most cases, you would have to be insane. Portuguese companies don't pay impressive salaries at all, and if you have the skills to do a job and you have the English language ability, you would go basically anywhere else in order to do it. I've heard people tell me things like, oh, Portugal is like California, there are so many startups and stuff here. I don't see that at all. What I see is that Portugal is much more like Florida or Thailand. And what you've got are masses and masses of retirees. And in addition to that, a lot of digital nomads, particularly in the urban areas. But those are people who are fundamentally working in English as the language of their work, not in Portuguese. So it's not really necessary for those people to learn Portuguese to do their jobs. And as far as I'm concerned, just like me, they can get by in English totally fine without the necessity of learning the language at all. The first method is simply to take an exam, which is run by an organisation called CAPEL in association with the University of Lisbon. They have test centres throughout Portugal and even abroad. You can go on their website, which I will link to in the description below, and you can book a test. The test that you need to pass for the citizenship or the permanent residency is at level A2. It's called SIPO. There are components for reading and writing, for oral production, and also for listening. I don't know that many people who've taken the exam, but some people say it's difficult, other people say it's quite straightforward. I really don't know what to make of it. I haven't taken the exam myself. I went the other route. By the way, if anyone's interested in taking this test, it has a relatively low cost of €79. However, the problem with it, as with many things in Portugal, is that it tends to be oversubscribed and there aren't actually that many vacancies available for taking the test. So you may have to try for an extended period of time before you're able to actually book a place for yourself. The pass mark for the SIPL exam is not very high, it's only 55%. If you get above that, your Portuguese will be considered sufficient for the purposes of permanent residency or citizenship application. Another alternative is that you can enroll yourself in one of the programs which are run by various organisations in Portugal designed to cater for immigrants who are looking to integrate into Portuguese society. For example, people who have come as refugees or people who have come here to work, etc., etc. One of the major organisations running these kinds of courses in Portugal are the Centro Qualifica organisation, and they tend to have their classes in high schools. So for example, I went to one of these in a high school in Coimbra. My neighbours attended one of these courses in a high school in Pombal. These classes tend to occur at night and they're over an extended period of time. So if you want to take A1 and A2, the course would have to be 150 hours at a minimum, and that's how they're designed. For the purposes of meeting the requirements set down in the citizenship law, it should be 150 hours, so they all do that. It sounds like not really that long, and there are a few intensive courses which go like Monday to Friday, and you've got morning and afternoon classes, but they are few and far between. The tendency that I've found is that most of the organisations schedule their classes in the evenings, basically to cater to people who have jobs. And this means that you can be having class from like 8 to 11 at night, 2 or 3 times a week. It's a little bit inconvenient. It wouldn't be what I would have chosen, but I went through it. My personal experience was that my classes were from 7 to 10 in the evening twice, and then 3 times a week towards the end of the course. Attendance in these courses is very, very important. You have to turn up. That's really half the battle. Examinations and things like that often aren't such a heavy feature of these language courses for immigrants. It's not like, the simple exam. There may be some presentations and things like that, but nothing too serious. However, this does vary from course to course. I heard stories from my neighbours that it was much, much more rigorous in their case, whereas in my own case, there weren't all that many assessments. Generally speaking, most people feel that these classes are more relaxing and easier in contrast to taking the exam. There are a lot of people who don't like the stress associated with exams, especially people who are coming to this a little bit later in life. In terms of the class that I attended, it was a real mix of nationalities, but I was the only European there. There was one American guy, but he left after a couple of weeks due to health problems, and there were about 25 other people in the class, and they all came from Central Asia, South Asia, or Africa, and there was one Chinese lady there. It was all in Portuguese. There was absolutely no English spoken. I had some basis because I had studied by myself, and also because I had attended the University of Coimbra, so for me it wasn't very difficult, but for some people it was a real struggle. One good thing about passing the CIPL exam or taking a course for language integration for immigrants is that the certificate that you get is valid indefinitely. It doesn't have some kind of time limit for expiration, and basically when you apply for citizenship or permanent residency, all you have to do is present that piece of paper. There's not going to be like a test to see if you're still up to date with your Portuguese or anything like that. I would recommend Ponto de Encontro, a great book which I will link to in the description below as a way to learn Portuguese. I actually spent about 8 months or so studying with that, and I went right through the book. It does A1, A2, B1 and B2 levels. So I was conversant with all of the grammar and the vocabulary in that book, and I actually had gone through it twice within that 8-month period. So I felt like I was in a pretty strong position to begin an A1, A2 course in Coimbra. When I did get to Coimbra in the university, I found the course to be pretty easy. I did it with my wife, who had no previous experience of Portuguese. She really enjoyed it and she wanted to stay on for another semester. My objective was just to get the certificate, and the University of Coimbra course did not offer me this immigration certificate. My wife prefers to take the exam. I preferred to get the certificate. So I left the university and I went and enrolled in another course in a language program run by the government. A few words on the University of Coimbra. I don't really think that universities in Portugal are fantastic. You know, the best one in the country is the University of Lisbon. It's ranked 260 in the world. The University of Coimbra is ranked 355 in the world. My general impression wasn't fantastic, but I will say my wife liked it a lot more. So, you know, there's a divergence of opinion there. You know, they didn't really turn the heating on very much in the winter. It was kind of at lukewarm temperature. I felt that the organisation and administration certainly was suboptimal. And just basic things like entering and leaving the building. You had to line up for like 50 minutes to leave. It was just ridiculous. There were other things that I didn't like. There weren't enough toilets in the building, for example. It was just very, very badly designed and planned. But in terms of the teachers and the curriculum, it was okay. I can say that I enjoyed it to a certain extent, but it's not something that I would like to repeat. So just as a general conclusion, is it vital to learn Portuguese as an expat living in Portugal? No, not unless you want to work and not unless you want to get PR or citizenship. I mean, those would be the reasons why you would need to do it. For everything else, you can probably get by with English, even in rural contexts. I know there are some people who say, no, that's not possible. It's only in the big cities. But my experience is that if you're just going to be a customer, if you're going to be using services, etc., basically everybody's going to make the effort to speak English to you because they can, and even if you do try to speak Portuguese, they're going to switch to English because they don't want to go through the process of dealing with you in Portuguese because your pronunciation is bad or whatever the story might be. Alright, well, that'll wrap up this video on learning the Portuguese language. I hope people found the content useful, and I'll see you soon in the next video.